What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we have a lot of catching up to do. So, we are picking up with Ultimate End and the Maker fighting for 2,000 years. So, what this does is this picks up 700 years in, and it kind of focuses on what happened when you had Howard Stark and the Maker going into the city at the end of Ultimate Invasion. Now, for those of you guys who need a bit of a refresh here, because it's been a while since we talked about this part of the Ultimate Universe, as most of you guys are probably aware, the Maker had jumped to this reality, Earth 6160, from the main Marvel Universe, and when he did, he started going through time and changing things, and so this ultimately led to Howard Stark and a handful of others, Kang from the future, showing up, confronting the Maker, and the whole battle took place inside the city within Latveria, the Maker's base of operations. At the end of Ultimate Invasion, the dome of the city was closed, and then we here in the real world were given a 2-year window. At the end of that 2 years, either the superheroes would go in or the dome would come down. As it's going right now, the Ultimates, basically this universe's version of the Avengers, have gone into the city, and now we're finding out what's been happening the entire time. So 700 years in, right, Howard Stark says, "I bravely sacrificed myself, setting off Soul's hammer in the city center, destroying Research District 1 just days before a breakthrough with their chronal battering ram, which would have allowed them to pop the Darwin bubble early, so to lower the dome." And he says, "Consumed by a million undone suns, the screams of dying children, terrible and inspiring. 80 years in, just the other day, I faced him a long time ago, still holding on to old habits, pretending to be what he wasn't. I felt a snap of nostalgia just before I felt the snap of my neck, and then nothing at all. 444 years in, legions of living weapons, fighting street by sentient street, watching as his children slaughtered mine, our perfected forms of death and destruction to make Plato proud. Poor Death's Head 18. He was always my favorite." And that's where Tony is just like, okay, you need to chill, but he continues on, right? 1,310 years in, leading a raid gone wrong long after he'd given up all pretense of humanity, the nauseating chemical taste of the Maker forcing himself down your throat. Do you know the sound your lungs make when they explode? It's just a puffing sound. And Tony tells him, "You're not making any sense, right? Stop jumping around and just start at the beginning. You were trapped here in the city, right? Begin with the beginning." And that's where Howard fires back and just says, "The Forever War defies traditional chronology and continuity. It rejects attempts to connect cause and effect. Its order is a higher order, war in 4 dimensions." Now, all he's really saying here is, number one, he's crazy. He's lost his mind, and I imagine just being alive for 2,000 years is going to do that. The human mind, no matter how intelligent it is, was not meant to experience 2,000 years of constant living. After a while, all the memories become a jumble. It just kind of becomes this chaotic mess. So when he talks about the idea of the Forever War, that's actually something that he references later on and kind of explains what the Forever War is, even though he doesn't necessarily do it very well right now. But what matters here is that because they've been fighting for so long, and because the memories are so jumbled, it's almost impossible to know exactly what happened when. And that's why he says things like, "Just the other day, I fought him a long time ago." Because for him, his first fight with the Maker may have been 80 years ago. It may have been 1,300 years ago, right? The times and places of these things just kind of get lost. And so that's where, in hearing all of this, Peter Parker's just like, we all have crazy family. I've got a great aunt who collects other people's taxidermied pets. The whole house is full of stuffed dogs, cats, even goldfish, which the goldfish part is weird, right? But that's where Tony asks, "What did you mean the Maker is the city?" And that's where Howard fills him in, and he says, "There I was, right? 1,610 years in, and I watched helpless as he absorbed the city mind, spreading like an oil spill, coating every atom. Fruiting bodies burst, spreading microplastic Maker spores." And that's where all these different forces of the Maker were breathing them in, right? And Howard Stark says, "Silicon machinery that remodels minds into receivers, extensions of the Maker mind." So for those of you guys who are familiar with Star Trek, we're basically talking about the Borg, is really what this is an allegory to, right? For those of you guys who don't know about Star Trek, The Borg are cyborgs, right? Borg is just a shorthand name for cyborg. But up until the stupid introduction of the Queen, there was never really any particular leader caste within the Borg. It was just all these individuals functioning as a cohesive unit, a hive mind, essentially. Except here, you have the Maker kind of controlling everybody. And so in hearing that, Tony Stark kind of points out the oily smog. That's what they first encountered when they came into the city. Initially, it gave off the appearance of it being something akin to like machinery, right? Pumping smog into the atmosphere and industrialization and so on and so forth. But that's where Howard says, if you take a breath, you will lose yourself and you will become an appendage, an extension of the Maker. And so Tony Stark points out, that's why you extended the Darwin bubble and you did it to keep the Maker cloud contained. And Howard says, exactly, right? Containment. It's the only workable strategy, delaying the inevitable. Now, that whole point of delaying the inevitable, that hits into the nature of the Forever War. And that's what we'll talk about here in a second. Because at that point, America Chavez chimes in, right? It's not really much of a delay. I mean, the way the bubble works, only a few microseconds have passed outside since we've been in here, right? And that's where Howard says, I don't really remember what's outside the wall, but I'm sure it's important, right? I had to buy time. So I reversed the field, which means instead of an astronomical amount of time passing on the outside, while a very short amount of time passes inside the city, it's the inverse. Because remember, that's what it was supposed to be. It was basically supposed to be as if you could somehow confine the Maker down to slow motion. So from his perspective, he's moving in real time. But outside of the city, things are passing by at light speed, right? Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years pass. The Ultimates have been operating under this assumption the entire time. But finding out that it's reversed, Spider-Man points out, if that's true, then it means that even though we've only been in here for a few minutes, months have passed outside. And so that's when you start to learn that in the months that have passed, there's effectively a kind of like zombie virus of sorts that have kind of spilled out into the streets of Latveria. Truth to tell, this is just kind of a callback to the original Ultimate Comics, because that's where the zombie virus started within Marvel, right? But beyond that, and the fact that Latveria is essentially quarantined, we start to find out certain things, right? For example, just kind of the Phantom Reporter, as it's pointed out, that Heaven remains quarantined from outsiders, with all gates now guarded by Bruce Banner's forces, but it's simply just too late. Now, for those of you guys who have forgotten about that, the Incredible Hulk is essentially Iron Fist in this Ultimate Universe, and so when it says that he guards Heaven, he's guarding the 7 heavenly cities, right, of the Iron Fist mythos. So essentially these, extra-dimensional realms. But he also has his immortal weapons and so on and so forth. So that kind of feeds into the nature of Matt Fraction's run and how all that stuff was explained. Just simply know that they guard these kind of extra-dimensional spaces and no one can essentially leave Earth and travel there, right? But the Phantom Reporter also points out that the forces of Heaven, right, the good guys who are kind of working against the Incredible Hulk and all those guys, that they've been preaching democracy and radical nonviolent resistance. Followers literally light themselves on fire in protest. But what's kind of crazy about this is that while immolating yourself doesn't really do anything against the forces that you're fighting, in this particular instance, people being forced to watch it are also forced to confront the fact that they kind of let things get to this point to a degree. So if anything, it serves as some measure of an inspiration for Iron Fist and his forces, however violent this may be. But it continues on. In the North American Union, Univision and anti-war machines have destroyed most of the Hand Hela fleet and freed the Rust Belt, which is a major blow to the Council. Of course, the Council basically being the Illuminati, the guys who control the world or controlled the world in the Maker's absence. Now they've just kind of fled to the four corners, with some of them kind of fighting their own individual wars, but the Council is effectively broken up by all standards of measurement, right? But something to keep in mind here is that Hand is basically like S.H.I.E.L.D. within the main Marvel Universe, except instead of focusing on threats that are a danger to life on Earth, they focus on threats that are a danger to the Maker's power and to the Council's power and control of the world. But now it's basically being undone. So again, all this is to say the good guys are basically fighting the fight and they're taking the world back. And so at that point, you switch over to Wakanda. And the way this whole conversation goes is it actually takes place between Eric Killmonger and T'Challa. Now, T'Challa's role within the Ultimate Universe has kind of been a source of debate among the comic book community, mostly because of the fact that he doesn't really operate like the Black Panther we're traditionally used to, which is to say, being out there on the front lines, taking the fight directly to the enemy, that kind of thing. He acts more like a king, right? Sitting on his throne, kind of partaking in various, gubernatorial policies and so on and so forth. Eric Killmonger is really the one that gets out there. Now, the nature of Eric Killmonger and the reason why he's being brought directly to T'Challa is that during the Ultimate Black Panther line, Eric Killmonger and Storm were freedom fighters, and they were also lovers at the same time. Because in this new Ultimate Universe, you have what's called the Upper and Lower Kingdoms, which are basically ruled by Ra and Khonshu, which collectively are Moon Knight. But all that really means is that outside of Wakanda, they control basically all of Africa. And so the efforts of Eric Killmonger and Storm were really designed to just kind of take on the forces of Moon Knight. But a lot of Eric Killmonger's resentment towards T'Challa was rooted in the idea that Wakanda was isolationist, right? With all their technological advancements, they could have used that to free Africa, but instead, they chose not to. And so when you initially have Eric Killmonger and Storm, who encounter Black Panther and actually save his life, there is some kind of, I wouldn't say disdain, but there's certainly a distaste with regards to how Wakanda carries itself in relation to the struggles of Africa as a continent overall. But what ends up happening is that Eric Killmonger and Storm are brought in to Black Panther's personal counsel as a thanks for saving his life, along with their own individual plot threads. And so that's why he's talked to as the Sword. And so that's why in this conversation, Black Panther tells Eric Killmonger, there is a thing that must be done. And Killmonger says, King T'Challa, right, I am your sword. I have been waiting. Is it war? The boy's message, the maker. And T'Challa says, indeed. And so at that point, Eric Killmonger just says, all this injustice, this deprivation, this rage I have felt my entire life, all because of one man. Can it be so simple? Because keep in mind, Eric Killmonger didn't know everything about the Maker, or the fact that the Maker had hopped and skipped through the time stream and changed so much of this universe's history. And so T'Challa tells him, right, no, of course not. Our problems are much older than the Maker, as old as man itself. Because people are no different than just conducting a chemistry experiment, right? You want to see how two chemicals react to each other? Put them in a beaker and add heat. So as long as you have 3 people in a room, right, if they're in that room long enough, eventually tempers are going to flare, and eventually they'll start fighting one another for one reason or another. So that's why he talks about, being older than man. It's the nature of human nature, right? All it simply means is that in the here and now, the Maker is the most current representation of human nature, as far as it manifesting in the form of a bad guy looking to seize power. But he says, if we are to solve them, right, these problems, if we are to free a continent, all peoples, the Maker cannot be allowed to return. He would have the entire world in chains or no world at all. And so that's why he says, I did not name you my sword. I named you the Sword of Wakanda. So be the sword, Eric Killmonger. Be our vengeance and our protector. Kill the Maker. And so that's where he basically goes on his own mission. And so for the most part, it just kind of follows him. Now, to this particular bit of a conversation here, you jump back over to Howard Stark, and he kind of starts filling things back in again for Tony and the rest of the Ultimates, right? And he says, my machine men could not kill the Maker, despite endless numbers, destructive power, and lightning fast artificial intelligences. The invincible Iron Army was made in my image, neural networks modeled on my perfect mind. And that's where the current iteration of Death's Head is just like, it was a big mistake, right? They just spend all day exchanging lewd messages in binary and hacking their own systems to simulate altered states. And that's where Howard continues on, and he says, the Deathlocks could not kill the Maker, constructed from the corpses of dead children, purged of the Maker's taint, death incarnate. And that's where Death's Head says, he meant them to be mindless, but some defect in the design means they spend most of their time composing bad science fiction short stories, fumbling awkwardly with big questions about life, death, and the future in the turgid prose of death. And America Chavez is like, I'd actually like to read some of that. But again, Howard kind of continues on with this bit of a story, and he says, of course there is Death's Head 23, my latest field commander. But again, Death's Head's like, I'm actually version 22, but whatever. And Howard just says, one of my finest designs, ruthless, unstoppable, and completely for sale, an entrepreneur to his nuclear core. Of course, he is no Death's Head 21, but that's where America's like, I don't really understand. How can he be a soldier of fortune, right? Do you even have an economy here, right? Much less currency. And that's where Howard is just like, I invented a digital currency for just this purpose, Starkbucks. And I can give you some, right, if you have something to sell. And while Death's Head is like, they're only redeemable in the gift shop, and Peter's excited about there being a gift shop, right? Howard Stark is like, it's closed for remodeling. And Death's Head's like, it's been closed for remodeling like since forever. But again, kind of getting back on track, right? America says, what is this place anyway? Are we even still in the city? And that's where things start to become really interesting, because Howard Stark says, no, this is Limbo, the place where nothing ever changes. And initially, Tony asks, right, the hell dimension that's ruled by Ilyana Rasputin, but the response of Howard is no, right? Everything here is living on borrowed time. Limbo is composed of stolen seconds, a few from one century and a few from another. We are everywhere and nowhere at once. Now, of course, this is based entirely on the Limbo dimension from the main Marvel universe, which is exactly what it sounds like, right? In Marvel Comics, you have two Limbos, the Hell dimension that's ruled by Ilyana Rasputin, so it's a demonic realm, and then you have the Limbo where Immortus resides. Like, it exists outside of time and unaffected by time, which kind of allows Immortus to sort of monitor everything, right? One of the things we've talked about over the years is the relationship between Immortus, Kang, Iron Lad, which we won't necessarily go into here, but Immortus is basically what Kang the Conqueror will ultimately become. And that's why he resides outside of space and time instead of trying to manipulate things to conquer all of reality. But Tony Stark, in seeing this, right, he asked the question, is that your Immortus engine? And Howard just says, the Maker Mind is powerful, yes, but still, it is limited to 3 dimensions. The Lord of Time knows no such limits. And he says, that's me, right? He cannot follow us here. And then the question's asked, why would the Maker still be limited, right? He's had thousands of years to fix himself. But that's where Howard says, who knows, right? There are holes that can never be filled. And he says absences that are reflected and magnified in everything you do or become, which particularly hits to Doctor Doom. Because keep in mind, in the Ultimate Universe, Doctor Doom is this reality's version of Reed Richards, right? His entire history was adjusted, changed, and broken by the Maker, who in turn convinced Reed Richards it was actually his fault, when it was really the fault of the Maker. But that's what turned this reality's Reed into Doctor Doom in the first place. And so that's where it all kind of continues on, right? Tony Stark says, look, Dad, ever since I've been here, my Immortus engine has not been working. Can you help? And that's where Howard just says, right, in Origin Box, right, the primitive prime moving prototype. He says, I haven't really seen any one of these in a long time, right? Where did you find this piece? Now, the reason why it's considered a prime moving prototype is because much like the way in which some people view God, right, as opposed to a being that interacts with everyone's individual lives and controls the direction they go in, that God just kind of sets things in motion, right, just pushing a domino and then just seeing how the dominoes fall. And that's kind of what this is, right? In Origin Box, you give it to someone and say, this is the person you were meant to become. And then they open the Origin Box and their path unfolds however it unfolds from there, based on whatever choices they make. And so that's what's happening here, right? That Tony Stark got one from his father at the very beginning of all of this during Ultimate Invasion. But again, Howard does not remember Tony. And in fact, he says that. When Tony says, it's me, Dad, right? It's Tony. The response of Howard, I don't know who you are. Right? And so Dr. Doom asks, is he always like this? And Death's just says, thinking in 4 dimensions too long will drive you mad. Your meat minds were not meant for this. And also, he is really drunk, right? He's very drunk right now. But Howard Stark kind of cuts in the middle of everybody talking, and he says, I've died more times than can be counted trying to kill the Maker for reasons I long ago forgot. I have given every second 100-second chances. The Maker always wins. A temporary stalemate is the best you can hope for. Your smooth-minded meddling could upset the balance that I have struck here. Now, that's the nature of the Forever War. The Forever War is a permanent and perpetual war of all against all. It's Thomas Hobbes, right? For those of you guys who don't know about Thomas Hobbes, he was a political philosopher way back in the day, right? Lived through the British Revolution, I think it was. But the idea behind it was that if you have a society with no ordered government, that's called a state of nature. Eventually, someone's going to break the social contract, stealing, potentially killing someone, hoarding resources to themselves. And in that instance, people are going to need some kind of a government. But Thomas Hobbes believed that people were terrible, that life was short, brutish, and cruel. So a perpetual and permanent war of all against all. That's what you're seeing here. And so that's why Howard says that the best you could hope for is a stalemate, right? Just holding the Maker off as best they can and just doing it forever and just doing what you can to make sure that the Maker never escapes. That's it. That's all that ever takes place within this city. Just fighting endlessly forever. And so with Peter Parker hearing all of this, he's like, okay, cool. So basically you guys have a stalemate. You guys are going to be fighting in perpetuity, right? For all eternity. Cool. I'm down to go back, right? I've learned everything I need to know. The reality here is nothing can be done to fix this place. Let's bail. But then he's told by Howard, right? You cannot go back, right? There is no way for you to get out of this place without risking releasing him, right? And so Peter's just like, why? right? And everyone's just kind of like, you can't really keep us here, right? But the response of Howard, I can, right? I must keep you here, but do not worry, you will be safe. The problem is that in the midst of all of this, there's a perimeter breach, right? And the response of Howard, like, it's impossible. There's no way that can be done. And so at that point, you switch over to Eric Killmonger and the Ultimates Network. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that the Ultimates Network was literally a network set up by the Ultimates themselves. That while not everybody out there in the world is a superhero, it gives them some ability to feel like one. Because by having a singular network outside the control of the council, it allows everyone to take everything they see and to upload it to the network. So everyone has eyes and ears everywhere. So whatever story the council concocts about what happened in this battle or what happened in that battle, that video footage can be uploaded and then just viewed by anybody who's part of the network to see what actually happened and to get to the bottom of the real story. And so that's what people are saying here, right? I work at the Roxxon Immoraran uranium mine. This video is from today, right? Somebody asks, is that Black Panther? And another person says, no, it's Killmonger, the Wakandan freedom fighter. Hashtag educate yourself. Right? And somebody asks, is he on the network? Right? It seems like he's one of our guys. But people are asking, right? Who cares? Everybody knows Wakanda and Roxxon have been beefing for a long time. That he told us that the mine was ours now and Wakanda could enforce our claim. And so people are kind of going back, right? They're learning about this kind of conflict that's been going on for a while. They're learning about Wakandan freedom fighters. They're learning that there are people fighting on their behalf. But for Eric Killmonger himself, this guy is amazing, right? Because as people are chiming in and having these conversations, right? Maker Loyalist Army intercepting Killmonger flying through Algerian airspace. That sword is pure vibranium. It's more powerful and more versatile than any conventional weapon. And when somebody asks, right, how do you know so much about it? The funny thing is that the person who tweeted the comment and talked about how the sword is pure vibranium, that's Okoye. That's the wife of T'Challa on the Ultimates Network. And so for some reason, I don't know why, I love the idea that like Black Panther's wife is literally talking on social media. I think that's just kind of hilarious to me. And I think it's awesome because she's filling people in with information they wouldn't otherwise have because they wouldn't know how to access it. And so while Eric Killmonger is tearing through all these forces with the greatest of ease. I mean, we're talking about like a hot knife through butter, right? The conversation continues on. I took this video in my home city, right? Look at this, right? Another person says, what's going on here? What is he doing, right? And somebody's just like steadily making his way north, right? Slowly but steadily heading north to Latveria, right? And somebody asks, is he the tip of the spear? Wakandan invasion of Europe? And that's where somebody says, I don't really think so, right? He's not wearing the Wakandan colors, markings, or symbols. Whatever he's doing it unofficially. So that's the other benefit of having this network, is that all these individuals are basically communicating and they're exchanging information. But that's where Okoye chimes in again, right? Wrong. The sword is the symbol. That's one of the weapons of the state, right? And so while it's not a full-on invasion by Wakanda itself, or even Wakanda itself getting out there and acting, at the end of the day, it is demonstrating that Wakanda is getting involved in the fight in some capacity. And so once Eric Killmonger finally makes his way to the city, again, we get filled in. Because where people start talking about the idea that he's going to the city, it's the only reason for him to be there, then somebody asks why, right? The dome is closed, no getting in or out. And somebody else says, spooky stories coming out of Latveria, temporal backwash from the city, weird anomalies, strange behavior from locals who stayed behind. And somebody asks, right, do we have anyone there? And somebody says, most of us evacuated, a few stayed behind, but I have not been able to reach them in some days. And so the city has effectively fallen. And in fact, Eric Killmonger himself is being surrounded by all these individuals within Latveria who have just been transformed in whatever their monstrous forms are. And so in the midst of this invasion going on within the city, you pick back up with the Maker's forces, right? And they say, I found you, Howard, right? I should have known, hiding in a knot of stolen time. But again, it's basically the Maker speaking through his forces. And that's where Howard's just like borrowed, right? Not stolen. But America asks, how in the world did they invade this place? And Howard initially thinks you guys must have been the ones to do it. You led them here. As soon as you arrived here, they started tracking you. And then they figured out where I was. But at that point, the only real focus is to guard the engine and to make sure the engine is not taken by the Maker, lest he uses it to shut down the dome and invade all of creation. And so at that point, the Maker says, 2,000 years, Howard, I have waited 2,000 years for this. And at that point, Howard just says, big deal, right? Try 2 million. And he says the Maker must not have the Immortus engine. The engine maintains the dome. If released, he will smear himself across the face of all of reality. But Peter's just like, we get it, man, right? Protect the Immortus engine or everyone we know and love dies. And so the Ultimates immediately jump into the fray and start going after all the forces of the Maker. Not only that, the Maker recognizes America Chavez, not necessarily by name, right? Not necessarily by who she is, but more like what she represents, right? He says, I smell the outside on you, and something else. Is that the future, failure? And then he realizes she's the refugee, that she does not belong here, and she's not supposed to be here. Because keep in mind, America Chavez comes from the future, and she was supposed to go back to the future, but chose to stay in the past in order to help give the Ultimates a fighting chance against the forces of the Maker. The problem is that as things began to unfold, they didn't really unfold the way they were supposed to, based on the time stream. Things had been changed and altered, so there was only so much help she was able to offer. But at the end of the day, she's able to offer a pretty significant amount of assistance nonetheless, right? You have Spider-Man facing off against the Maker, right? Where he just says, stop fighting me and help, right? But the Maker just says primitive genetic enhancements, limited precognition, and pico technology. And he says, we have been cork sculpting for centuries. We can overcome you like that. And literally overtakes Peter and just throws him down to the ground and beats him quite readily. At that point, the Maker directly addresses Dr. Doom, right? He says, hello, Doom. How nice to see your face. And so again, with the Ultimates themselves, alongside Death's Head facing off against these guys, right? That the Maker says, the machine is mine. First the dome, and then everything else. This all unfolds with the inevitability of history. And so in order to motivate everybody to fight, right? Just because of the fact that Death's Head is just kind of like, look, victory's impossible, right? This one's self-preservation circuits are driving me to effectively abandon this fight, that Howard Stark says 10 trillion Starkbucks for 10 more seconds, Death's Head, and I reopen the gift shop. And Death's Head's just like, deal, right? And it's just like, jumps back into the fight again. But the funny thing here, right, is with the Maker overtaking Spider-Man, right? He says, it's coming back to me. The Arachnid Kid, wasn't it? Isn't that what you called yourself? And where Venom tells Peter, right, let me take over, let me handle this fight, Peter says no, right? I will get out of this on my own. But at the end of the day, Howard Stark is able to move the Immortus engine slightly out of phase with the current time stream to the point that the Maker cannot find it and he cannot access it, right? He says, you'll find it eventually, but I've bought them more time. I am a hero. They'll all remember whoever they are. And so Howard tells everybody, right, we are running out of time, and there is still the matter of this, right? The origin box in Tony's chest. And Tony just says, I can't make it work, right? I don't know how to get this thing to function. And Howard just blasts it, right? And he says the rules are different here. The engine must be recalibrated to work with the novel space-time geometry. It took me a few years. In his current form, it would take the Maker minutes. And so Tony kind of starts begging his dad to stop, right? Because he's kind of overcharging this whole thing. But Howard tells him, with an Immortus engine, the Maker will destroy this reality and replace it with a new one. Everything I have built, everything I've done, none of it will matter. So he's literally destroying it, right? And so Howard tells Tony, I am sorry, Tommy, but I do not see the resemblance between you and me. But at the end of the day, Tony does the only thing he can do. He ends up firing off an energy blast at Howard because Howard's killing him, right? That's the nature of destroying that origin box. It would kill Tony, right? So self-preservation, he ultimately ends up kind of destroying his father, right? He doesn't die immediately, but in that moment, he recognizes Tony, right? Recognizes him as his son, or one of the many sons that he's had. And he says, I remember who you are, right? And he remembers that moment way back when, Conqueror, Destroyer, when Ultimate Invasion happened, and he was forced to go into the city and tell his son to run. But at the end of the day, the Ultimates show up here and they say, Tony, we have to leave, right? Come with us, we have to go. And Tony just says, no, right? Not without my dad. He will not leave him behind. And so in the face of this, the Maker starts taunting Howard. And he says, you've aged poorly, Howard. And where initially Howard's like, why crack jokes in a time like this? The response of the maker is he says, call it nostalgia. I've reconstituted my old personality for old time's sake. Here at the end, a bit of the beginning, or perhaps speaking English just brings it out of me. But I can keep you alive and in agony for all eternity, Howard. I will torture you with your own stolen time. Give me the engine. But the response of Howard is he says, you don't listen. The engine is gone. This place is not made of stolen time. It's made of borrowed time. And without the engine, that time has run out. And the response of the maker is no, right? I will have it, Howard. I will have it all. But the response of Howard when he talks to Deathhead is he says, listen, my son, before we evaporate into absence, I have to tell you, Deathhead 18 was always my favorite Death's Head, which is kind of a dick thing to say. But at the end of the day, you kind of jump back, right? And you have America who just says, we're back where we started, trapped in the city with no way to win, right? And even Spider-Man says, like, we're sitting ducks out here. Like, we have to go somewhere or we have to do something. We cannot stay in this place. But in the midst of all of that, the maker's voice comes out of nowhere and it just says, welcome home, Doom. It's good to have you back. Your help finding Limbo was appreciated, but killing Immortus was just the beginning of our work together. Do not worry. I have no doubt you will make the Maker proud, because seemingly all this time, Dr. Doom has been a double agent for the Maker, and some of you called it. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.